The chain hit the auction block with a sound like a death knell, and David Sutton stopped walking. He had been on his way to buy rope. Good, thick rope, the kind that didn't fray when you sent it down 40 feet into the dark earth with a man's weight behind it. He needed 3 coils of it before the pass froze and the monastery markets closed for the winter. He had not planned to stop at the eastern square, where the iron pens smelled of old fear, and the crowd pressed in with the particular hungry energy of people watching something they told themselves was legal. But the chain had struck the block, and the sound had dragged him sideways, and now he was standing at the edge of the crowd with his purse in his hand and his eyes fixed on the platform. She was not what he expected. He had seen orc war captives sold through Coldthorn Pass before. They usually came in broken shoulders caved, eyes fixed at some middle distance, the fire already leached out of them by a hard march in irons. The buyers who came to these markets knew that, and they bid accordingly, looking for something useful but not too spirited. This one was spirited. She stood with her wrists chained above her head to a crossbar, and she was looking at the crowd the way a wolf looks through the bars of a trap, not with despair, but with a cold and calculating fury that was cataloging every face, measuring every distance, waiting for the precise moment when the calculation would tip in her favor. She was tall, built like something that was meant to endure, with muscle that moved under green-dark skin like rope under silk. She wore the remains of warriors, leathers a fitted vest of dark, riveted hide that had been cut to hug her frame before someone had torn the left shoulder half free, and close-fitting riding trousers tucked into knee-high boots with iron buckles, half of them missing now but the boots still holding. Her tusks were small and straight, a warrior clan's mark, and her black hair had been braided back before the fight that had taken her, though half of it had pulled free and hung loose across her jaw in ropes. There was dried blood on her temple that she had clearly not been allowed to wash, and she wore it like it was someone else's problem. The auctioneer was listing her qualities with the enthusiasm of a man who understood that enthusiasm was his trade. Orc female, prime age, assessed at 23 years. Clan-trained warrior, that's what you're getting here, that's strength you're buying, that's, she said something in Orcish that David did not speak, but the auctioneer flinched, which told him everything. The crowd laughed, but it was the nervous kind of laugh. 3 women near the front were not laughing. David noticed them because they were dressed for it, armored, badge-pinned, the kind of women who came to these markets professionally. 2 were human, 1 was a half-orc, and all 3 wore the sigil of the Iron Heel brokerage on their shoulders, a company David knew by reputation as the sort that bought war captives and worked them in the deep mines north of the Ashen Ridge until the work was finished. The half-orc was watching the captive on the platform with a particular focused attention, writing something on a ledger slate, already calculating the price of a rival who had apparently ended up on the wrong side of someone's contract. David's jaw tightened. He looked at his purse. He looked at the platform. He was a well-digger. He had no business buying anyone. He had no estate to take her to, no authority to offer her, and at least 4 good reasons why this was someone else's problem. The bidding opened at 11 silver marks. The 3 Iron Heel women bid 13 without blinking. David stepped forward. The first time he raised his hand, people looked at him the way they always did with mild confusion, because he looked like what he was, a working man in a road-worn coat with chalk dust on his boots and rope calluses thick on both palms. He was broad in the shoulder and square in the face, not remarkable in any way that crowds noticed, and he had the particular quality of someone who had spent most of his adult life doing hard, essential work that everyone needed and almost no one thanked. The 3 Iron Heel women glanced at him. The half-orc's eyes narrowed. He bid 16. The crowd shifted. Several people moved closer. The woman on the platform turned her head for the first time. Her eyes found him. They were the color of dark amber, and they fixed on his face with the same wolf-through-bars expression she had been giving the rest of the crowd, but there was something else in it now, something that was not quite calculation and not quite surprise and not quite anything he had a clean word for. He did not look away. The Iron Heel women bid 19. He bid 22. The auctioneer was visibly surprised. The three women turned to look at him properly now, and the half-orc said something to the taller human woman that David couldn't hear over the crowd noise. The taller woman smiled, and it wasn't a friendly smile. He bid 25. That was the last of it. He had exactly 25 silver marks and some copper, and he had intended to spend 20 of them on rope and keep the rest for lodging and a meal before starting back down the mountain. He had no rope money now. He was going to have to explain that to the monastery steward, and the steward was not a man who received explanations with much warmth. The Iron Heel women did not bid again. He didn't understand that until later. He was too busy watching the auctioneer's hammer come down. The chain was unlocked by a bored-looking guard who clearly expected some kind of trouble from it, and what he got was a woman who stepped down from the block with all the dignity of someone who had been inconvenienced rather than sold. She walked toward David through the crowd, and the crowd parted for her the way it always parted for things it was privately afraid of, and she stopped in front of him. She was 4 inches taller than him, maybe 5. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. "I am not your property," she said. Her common was accented but precise, the kind of precise that comes from learning a language by force and then deciding to be better at it than the people who forced it on you. "I know," he said. Another pause. "Then what is this?" "This is me getting you off that platform," he said, "before the Iron Heel Company bought you and sent you somewhere much worse. What you do after this is your own business." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the Iron Heel women who were watching from across the square with the patient, unhurried attention of people who had a plan B already written. "They will follow," she said. "Probably," he agreed. "You are not armed." "I have a knife." "That is not what I meant," he understood. He was not in any obvious way someone who was capable of helping her with what was probably coming. He had no soldiers, no authority, no walls to put between her and people who had apparently already decided she was their business. "My name is David Sutton," he said. "I dig wells. I know the pass, every trail, every switchback, every place the patrols don't go. I'm offering you a head start and knowledge of the ground. That's all I've got." She looked at him for another breath. Her amber eyes moved across his face like she was reading something written in a language she was still translating. "Ghorza Steeljaw-a," she said. "And you had better be right about the trails." He was already moving. The monastery market at the head of Coldthorn Pass was a peculiar kind of place, part trading post, part neutral ground, part way station for everything the two sides of the mountain needed from each other and couldn't get anywhere else. The monks who ran it technically governed the square mile around the gates, which meant that the usual laws about orc transit and human property claims were complicated inside those walls in ways that a man who knew the rulebook could exploit if he read fast and spoke clearly. David knew the rulebook. He had worked the pass for 6 years, digging wells and cisterns for the monastery itself, for the way station inns, for the 3 different estates that sat in the sheltered valley below, and for a handful of desperate homesteaders who paid him in venison and prayers when silver ran out. He knew the head monk's name, and the head monk's assistant's name, and the assistant's preferred hours for receiving difficult paperwork. He got Ghorza through 2 alleys and a storage passage before the Iron Heel women's runner reached the square. Brother Aldrich was at his desk when David knocked, and he looked up with the expression of a man who had learned that David Sutton knocking on his door at odd hours generally meant something complicated was about to become his problem. "I need a transit writ," David said, "for a freed person, under the monastery's neutral passage provision, Article 11. Brother Aldrich looked at Ghorza, who was standing in the doorway with dried blood on her temple and her wrists still red from the shackle rings, wearing an expression of aggressive calm that she seemed to maintain by sheer force of will. "That article," Brother Aldrich said slowly, "was written for pilgrims in distress." "She was distressed," David said. "I bought the chain, I cut it. As of now she's a freed person in transit. Article 11 says the monastery guarantees safe passage for freed persons in transit. It's the law of this house. Brother Aldrich looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the ceiling as though consulting something above his pay grade. Then he pulled out a sheet of vellum and began to write. "You know the Iron Heel Company is going to come through that door," he said. "I know," David said. "They have a purchase agreement, predated. Then let them bring it to the monks' council and argue their dates against mine. That takes 3 days minimum, and I only need 1. Brother Aldrich pressed his seal into wax at the bottom of the vellum and handed it over without looking up. "You owe me a well," he said. "I owe you 2, David agreed, and pocketed the writ, and they were moving again before the ink was dry. The room he had paid for at the Waystation Inn was small and cold and smelled of pine tar, which was as good as rooms got at this altitude in late autumn. He gave Ghorza the basin of water first and went a stand by the door while she cleaned the blood from her temple, and he used the time to think hard about what he had done and what it was going to cost him. The rope money was gone. The monastery steward was going to be furious. The Iron Heel Company was going to spend at least part of the next few days making his life difficult, and they had more legal leverage than he liked, and the writ from Brother Aldrich was good but not bulletproof. He had exactly 8 copper left, which was not enough to get 2 people down the mountain road in any comfort, and the pass had a way of turning nasty in late autumn without much warning. On the other hand, he pressed his forehead against the door and listened to the sound of water in the basin and told himself to stop adding that up. "You are calculating," her voice said from behind him. He turned. She had washed her face and retied the braid, and without the blood she looked different, not softer exactly, but less like someone in the immediate aftermath of catastrophe. She was sitting on the edge of the narrow bed with her elbows on her knees, and she was watching him with that steady amber gaze that had not stopped being disconcerting. "Hard not to," he said. "What is the calculation?" "Whether I can get you out of the pass before the Iron Heel Company's permit window opens tomorrow morning. And if you cannot, then the writ holds for the monks' council, and you wait 3 days in the monastery's guest cells, and I argue the dates, and I probably win, but 3 days is a long time to be inside walls with people who want to recapture you." She was quiet for a moment. "You said you know the trails. The main road's obvious. They'll have someone on it by midnight, but I worked a survey job 2 years ago for an old shepherd in the High Valley. There's a path that comes down the back side of the ridge, goat track mostly, narrow and ugly, but it skips the main Waystation checkpoint entirely. Comes out at the base village by the mill. How long? In daylight 5 hours, in the dark longer. And it'll be cold." She looked at him steadily. "I have been cold before." He believed her. They left before the market bells rang for evening prayer, slipping out through the monastery's kitchen garden, and through a gap in the lower wall that David had used before when he was running survey equipment after hours and didn't feel like walking around to the proper gate. Ghorza moved with a silence that was almost unsettling, given her size, a total economy of motion that made him acutely aware of his own tendency to step on every dry twig within reach. The goat track was exactly as unpleasant as he'd described. It ran along the spine of a ridge in the dark, switchbacking through loose shale that slid underfoot and dropped away into nothing on the downhill side. The wind came in cold and horizontal from the north, the kind of wind that was less weather than personality, with opinions about where you ought to be, and none of them favorable to where you currently were. David went first with the lantern turned low, and Ghorza came behind him with a hand on the rock face when the ledge went narrow, and neither of them talked much because the wind was too loud and the footing was too demanding. About 2 hours in, he stopped to check his bearings, holding the lantern up against a frost-rimed rock face to read the trail markers he had scratched there 2 years ago as a personal reference. He felt her stop behind him, close, the warmth of her in the cold air a physical thing. "The shepherd's carving," he said, pointing. "We're on the right path." She looked at the scratches. Then she looked at him, and in the low lantern light her eyes were the color of old honey, and she said, "You plan to come back this way." "I always plan an alternate route, professional habit. When you're digging a well 40 feet down, you think a lot about what happens if the primary option doesn't work." She made a sound that might have been, in different circumstances, a laugh. It was brief and she contained it quickly, but it changed something in her face, broke some tension he hadn't realized was there. "The people who brought me here," she said after a moment. "The ones who sold me, they were hired by a man named Drell Vaskin." He turned to look at her properly. "Vaskin, he's a cold thorn factor, buys and sells contracts." "He bought mine from my clan chief," she said. "My clan chief is not my chief anymore." The flatness in her voice when she said it told him everything he needed to know about how much that cost her to say. He didn't press it. He turned back to the path. "The Iron Heel women," he said instead. "The half-orc with the ledger, you recognized her." A pause. "Sarah Copperstone, she was of a rival clan. She trained with my cohort for 1 season before her clan sent her south." Another pause, shorter. "She was the one who gave the Iron Heel Company my name. She told them I was worth buying before the auction even opened." David was quiet for a moment. "So they weren't just at the market by chance?" "No, they let me overbid." "Yes." He thought about that. "They're going to wait for us at the bottom." "Yes," she said again. "Sarah knows I would go off-road. She trained with me. She knows how I think." He stood on the narrow ledge in the dark with the wind pushing at him and considered that problem carefully. "Then we don't go to the base village," he said. "We go to the dig." "What dig?" "There's a well project I started in the High Valley. An estate house half-built, owner not in residence until spring. I've got tools cached there, and there's a caretaker's cottage with a stove. It's off any road Sarah Copperstone is going to check against a map. You would take me to your work site." "Unless you have a better idea." He heard her exhale through her nose. "Lead," she said. The caretaker's cottage was exactly as he described, small, stone-walled, with a stove that needed coaxing but eventually produced heat, and a cache of his equipment in the lean-to. Rope coils, digging bars, a hand winch, provisions sealed in oilskin for winter work. He had a blanket roll, dried meat, hard bread, and a clay bottle of mid-grade spirits that was better than nothing when the cold was this specific kind of personal. He got the stove going while Ghorza stood in the middle of the room and looked around at his things with the careful, cataloging attention that seemed to be how she approached everything. "You live like this when you work," she said. "Mostly." He fed another stick into the stove. "I have a room in Thornwater Village below the pass. I use it when I'm not on a job, but a lot of the year I'm up here or further along the ridge. Alone." It wasn't quite a question, usually. She sat down on the floor near the stove, crossing her legs, and accepted the clay bottle when he offered it. She took one drink, made no reaction to the heat of it, and handed it back. "The Iron Heel Company has a standing contract with Vaskin," she said. "He sells them orc war captives at reduced rate, and they don't ask about the circumstances of capture. My clan was not at war. My chief signed a peace letter with the Valley Lords 6 months ago." Her voice was even, but there was something underneath it like a banked fire. "He sold me to clear a gambling debt. There was no raid, no battle. I was drugged at the midsummer feast and woke up in a cart." David looked at the stove and didn't say anything for a moment because nothing he could say was going to be adequate to that. "I'm sorry," he said finally, simple and direct because that was what he had. She looked at him. "You say that like you mean it." "I do mean it." Most humans who say they are sorry to an orc are saying it the way they say it to a dog that was kicked, reflexive, without actual thought. "I'm not most humans," he said. He wasn't being defensive about it, just factual, the same way he'd say he was left-handed or that he preferred his coffee without sweetener. She studied him. The firelight moved on her face, catching the angle of her jaw and the straight edge of her tusks, and the place where the dried cut at her temple had begun to heal already with the speed he'd heard orcs managed, their bodies working harder at repairs than human bodies did. "You spent your rope money," she said. He glanced at her. "Excuse me." "At the auction, you were going to buy rope. You told the monk's assistant you needed it before the pass froze. You spent it instead." She tilted her head slightly. Why? He thought about deflecting. He was actually fairly good at deflecting, having spent years doing work that required honest answers to honest questions and nothing more. But she had a way of asking things that made the deflection feel like it wasn't worth the effort. The Iron Hill Company sent people into those mines, he said. I've seen what comes out the other end. I didn't want to see you go in. Silence. The stove ticked with heat. That is a significant amount of money to spend on a person you do not know, she said. I know. I'll figure out the rope situation. He pulled his coat tighter. Try to sleep. We'll need to be moving before dawn if we're going to stay ahead of them. She didn't move toward the blanket roll immediately. She kept watching him, and he kept not being quite able to read what she was doing with the information he kept accidentally giving her about himself. David Sutton, she said eventually, tasting the name like she was memorizing it. That's me. You are a strange man. I've been told. She did sleep eventually, curled near the stove with the efficiency of someone who had learned to rest wherever rest was available. And he sat by the door with his knife across his knees and listened to the wind outside and the steady sound of her breathing, and tried not to think too carefully about the fact that he was doing it. The next 2 weeks were, by any objective measure, some of the most uncomfortable of David Sutton's career. The Iron Hill Company was patient. That was the thing he hadn't quite counted on. He had expected a direct chase, boots on the trail, someone following the goat track, but Sarah Copperstone was apparently smarter than that. She settled in at the base village and she waited, which meant Ghorza couldn't come down off the mountain without walking into her. David's work in the high valley at least gave them a reason to be where they were. He had 3 cisterns to complete before the estate owner arrived in spring, and the tools were cached, and the work was real. He put his head down and dug, which was what he did when everything was uncertain, because at 40 feet down the uncertainty was at least a different shape. Ghorza did not sit and wait for rescue. That was something he learned about her in the first day and confirmed repeatedly afterward. She was up before him most mornings, had scouted the ridge line by the time he came out of the cottage, and had returned with specific, tactical information about the trails and who was using them. She found a water source he hadn't located in 2 years of working the valley. She repaired the winch mechanism that had been jamming since October with a piece of wire and a competence that was frankly embarrassing. "Where did you learn to work a winch?" he asked, when she handed it back to him running smooth. "I was a scout," she said. "Scouts fix what breaks." He put her to work. It seemed less condescending than the alternative, which was leaving her standing idle while he dug, and she made it clear on the second morning that idle was not a state she intended to inhabit. She couldn't do the deep work alone. The well-digging methodology he used required a specific technique, and he had to direct it. But she was the best winch operator he had ever worked with, and she understood structural problems with the cold, practical eye of someone whose life had regularly depended on understanding what held things up. They worked beside each other through cold days and cold evenings, and somewhere in the rhythm of it, without a single dramatic announcement, they stopped being a man and a woman in an emergency and became something else. He started talking to her the way he talked to himself when he was working out loud, working through problems, thinking by speaking, which was a habit he'd had since apprenticeship and which he'd never quite been able to break. She listened. She answered. She asked sharp questions that forced him to think more carefully than he would have otherwise. She was, he realized about a week in, the most naturally intelligent person he had spent extended time with in several years. "The cistern wall is going to crack here," she said one afternoon, crouching next to the stonework with her hand on the mortar joint, "when the ground freezes. You've laid this course on a downhill angle. The ice will push." He crouched beside her. She was right. He could see it now that she said it, the slight tip to the course that he'd been in too much of a hurry to correct when he said it. He swore under his breath. "I can relay it," he said. "It'll cost me a day. Better a day now than a collapsed wall in the spring thaw." He looked at her. She was still looking at the stonework, and the late afternoon light caught the side of her face and the clean angle of her jaw and the small scar above her left eyebrow that she'd had before the auction. He looked away again. "You ever think about building?" he asked. "You've got a good eye for it." "Warriors think about what breaks," she said. "It is the same skill, only the purpose differs." "It's not the same skill." "It is. You are thinking about how to keep things standing. I think about how to make them fall." She glanced at him then, and one corner of her mouth moved. "Perhaps we balance each other." He felt something shift in his chest that he decided not to examine too closely. They were 13 days into the high valley when the runner came up from the base village with a note from Brother Aldrich. The Monks' Council had ruled on the Iron Heel Company's purchase agreement. The predating was suspicious but not provably fraudulent, and the transit writ David held was valid for 40 days under Article 11, but 40 days would expire before the matter was fully resolved if Vaskin filed a counterclaim, which he apparently had. The note also said that the 3 Iron Heel women had been joined at the base village by 2 of Vaskin's hired riders. 5 people waiting at the bottom of the mountain, and winter proper was 10 days away at most. David read the note twice. Then he walked to where Ghorza was working the winch at the second cistern and told her what it said. She went still. Not the stillness of fear, but the focused stillness of a person making tactical calculations very quickly. "Vaskin will file the claim to delay the monk's process," she said. "He doesn't need to win the legal case. He needs to keep me in the pass until winter closes the road, and the monks must defer jurisdiction to the Valley Lords. The Valley Lords answer to the Trade Guild. The Trade Guild contracts with Iron Heel." "That's what I figure too," David said. "So we cannot wait them out." "No." She looked at the ridge to the north, then to the south, where the pass road wound down out of sight. "What is the other way down?" "There isn't one, not in any normal sense." He hesitated. "There is the old Drove Road. It's technically a road, meaning someone called it that once and then abandoned it when the bridge over the Coldwater fell. The bridge fell 40 years ago and nobody's rebuilt it because the Coldwater in autumn is, can you cross it? The Coldwater. In late autumn." He looked at her. "It's about 12 feet wide at the ford point, 2 feet deep in summer. In late autumn it's maybe 15, maybe 3 deep, and the current's strong because the snowmelt from the high peaks comes through it. It's cold." "I have been cold before," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him with perfect, level patience. "The ford is passable," he said. "If you know where the flat rocks are, I know where they are. I surveyed the Coldwater in the spring because the estate owner asked about redirecting irrigation. Then we crossed the Coldwater." He closed his eyes briefly. "Fine," he said. "But we pack everything we need beforehand because once we're on the Drove Road there's no coming back to the cottage." They moved at dawn, 2 days later, after he'd spent those days caching his tools properly and sending a message back to Brother Aldrich through the runner with instructions about the cistern work and the location of his notes, because he was not the kind of man who left unfinished business without documentation if he could help it. The Drove Road was overgrown, half swallowed by 20 years of autumn growth since anyone had last maintained it, and it ran east along the ridge before dropping down through a pine forest to the valley floor. The Coldwater came through the valley bottom with the voice of something that took its own authority seriously. He heard Ghorza pull in a breath when they came out of the tree line and saw it. It was higher than he'd hoped. The recent cold had brought more snowmelt down from the high peaks, and it ran gray-white between its banks with a speed that was going to make the crossing ugly. "The flat rocks are here," he said, pointing. "You can't see them from above the surface, but they're there, a zigzag line. I'll go first and show you the angles." "No," she said. "I am heavier. If the rocks hold me, they will hold you. I go first." He thought about arguing and decided against it. She was right about the weight logic. He talked her through the line. She crossed it with the careful, precise footwork of someone who had trained her body to do exactly what her brain told it, and she reached the far bank and turned and looked at him, and he crossed with the water pulling at his shins and his boot leather soaking through and the rocks exactly where he remembered them. They stood on the far bank, wet to the knee and breathing hard, and the cold water ran behind them. "No one follows that on horseback," she said. "No one follows it on foot without knowing where the rocks are," he agreed. She made that sound again, the brief almost laugh. Then she turned south and started walking toward the lower valley, and he fell into step beside her, and he was aware, walking next to her in the cold morning light on the wrong side of the cold water from everyone who wanted to make her disappear, that he had stopped thinking of this as an emergency he was managing from the outside. Somewhere in the past 2 weeks she had become, without ceremony or announcement, his. Not in the sense of ownership, nothing like that, but in the way that a person you have walked through hard country with becomes part of your geography, part of what you navigate toward. He did not say any of that. He wasn't sure he had words for it yet. The Thornwater Valley spread below Coldthorn Pass like a shallow bowl, 3 villages and a dozen homesteads, and a mill town at the center where the river ran strong enough to work. David had a room at the mill town's only inn, a long-standing arrangement with the innkeeper, a stout and practical woman named Mags who had known him since his apprentice days and had the grace to ask no questions about anything as long as the room rate was paid. He could not pay the room rate. He had 8 copper. He explained the situation to Mags in the inn kitchen while Ghorza sat by the fire in the public room, and the other guests tried not to stare too obviously at the orc woman sitting among them, some successfully and some not. Mags listened. She had the expression of someone doing mental accounting. "I've got a debt tab from you going back 2 years, she said. "You've never missed a settlement." "I'll work it off," he said. "I've got contracts in the valley for 3 more cisterns before spring." "The money's coming." Mags looked toward the public room. "She going to cause trouble?" "No," he said. "Trouble might come looking for her, that's different." Mags considered it. "I've got a double room in the back. Cold in the mornings, but better than the stable." She held up a finger. "One trouble. I lose 1 paying guest over her being here and the arrangement ends." "Understood," David said. "Thank you. Don't thank me, just don't make me regret it." He didn't make her regret it, but he did not entirely control what happened in the next 2 days, because on the 3rd morning after they came down the mountain, Sarah Copperstone and the 2 Iron Heel women arrived in Thornwater Village. They had apparently found a way down the mountain that David hadn't anticipated, possibly by going back around through the Eastern Way station and taking the long road, which added 3 days to the journey but avoided the cold water problem entirely. He heard about it from the mill town smith, who told him over the forge that 3 women with Iron Heel badges had been asking about a runaway orc and a well-digger. He went back to the inn and told Ghorza. She was very still for a moment. Then she stood up. "I will not run again," she said. He had expected this in some way. He had been watching her for weeks now, and he knew the shape of her stubbornness, which was different from ordinary stubbornness in that it was not emotional but structural, built into how she stood up in the world, the same way a keystone is structural and not a choice. "We're not running," he said. "I've been thinking about this. The valley market opens in 4 days. Thornwater Village holds a public market every fortnight, and it's governed by the Valley Charter, not the Pass Authority. Under the Valley Charter, a freed person holds status if they can demonstrate 10 days of lawful residence." She looked at him. "We have been in the valley for 3 days. Technically 4 if you count the day we crossed the ford, which is valley floor land." He pulled out the transit writ from Brother Aldrich. "Combined with this, which gives 40-day passage, we have enough to make an argument that Iron Heel's claim is jurisdictionally invalid in this valley." She was silent for a moment. "Who makes that argument?" "The market charter mediator. There's one, her name is Rowan Dace. She runs a dry goods stall in the regular market, and she's also the appointed mediator for any charter disputes. I've worked jobs for her brother. She knows me. Knowing you is not the same as agreeing with you." "No," he said, "but it's a start." He sent a message to Rowan Dace that afternoon. Rowan Dace sent a message back that said she would hear the matter at the market in 4 days, publicly, as the charter required, and that all interested parties were invited to present their case, and that she would appreciate it if David Sutton stopped sending her complicated problems through her brother. The next 4 days were tense and careful. David worked. He had a cistern job in the lower valley that he was already behind on, and he needed the income, and going back to work was also the most normal thing he could think to do in a situation that was not particularly normal. Ghorza came with him. She did not stay at the inn while he worked, and he did not suggest it, because she would have ignored the suggestion and the discussion would have wasted time they didn't have. The homestead owner where he was digging, a thick-armed farmer named Holt, looked at Ghorza when they arrived, and then looked at David with a question he was clearly trying to phrase in a way that wouldn't offend either of them. "She's my partner," David said. Simple, factual, and he chose the word without allowing himself to think about it too carefully. Holt looked at them both for a moment. "Right," he said. "Well, I've got coffee on." They drank coffee in Holt's kitchen and David talked the cistern job through, and then they went to work. And Holt joined them after an hour because the man was constitutionally unable to watch other people do hard work on his property without helping. And by the end of the day, all 4 of them were filthy and productive, and Holt's wife had made enough stew for 6. It was a strange, domestic interlude in what was otherwise a crisis, and David was aware of how much he liked it, which was information he filed away without acting on. Ghorza noticed everything. He had grown to accept that about her the way you accept that a good hunting dog will always scent what's ahead. When Holt's wife asked her a question about the local clay composition, and she answered it with the same careful precision she applied to everything, and the wife's expression shifted from cautious politeness to genuine interest, and they talked for 20 minutes about subsoil structure, and why certain cisterns lasted 40 years and others cracked at the first frost, David felt something in his chest that he also declined to examine. On the morning of the market, the mood in Thornwater Village was different. He noticed it as soon as they walked into the square. Markets in small valley towns have their own particular energy, which is social as much as commercial, and the people here knew each other and knew their business and knew what was unusual. The presence of 3 Iron Heel women with their company badges and a pair of Vaskin's riders in the square was unusual. Word had moved through the village in the way words moved through small places, faster than any formal announcement. People were looking, not all of them with hostility. Some with curiosity, some with the wary neutrality of people who had learned not to pick sides until they could see which way things went. But some of them, the ones who had reason to know what Iron Heel did and what Vaskin's contract terms meant for the people they caught up in them, were watching with something more than that. Rowan Dace had set up her mediator's table in the center of the square, which was where the charter required public hearings to happen. She was a small, sharp-eyed woman of about 40 with ink-stained fingers and the bearing of someone who had settled enough arguments to stop being surprised by them. She looked at David and Ghorza when they arrived, and at the Iron Heel women who had already taken position on the other side of the table, and at Sarah Copperstone, who stood slightly apart from her employers with her ledger slate and her careful, still expression. The 2 of them had not spoken. Ghorza had seen Sarah the moment they arrived, and something in her face had gone very controlled, the way a fire goes controlled when you put a glass chimney around it. Rowan Dace called the hearing to order with 3 sharp knocks on the table, which was all the ceremony the Valley Charter required. The Iron Heel Company presented their case first, because they had filed the complaint. The tall human woman who introduced herself as Factor Lenny spoke crisply and clearly. She had a purchase agreement with date and seal. She had Vaskin's bill of conveyance. She had a charter argument that was, David had to admit, better than he would have liked, built on the precedent that a transit writ did not override a valid commercial claim. Rowan Dace listened without expression. Then David presented his case. He laid out the transit writ. He laid out the calculation of days in the valley that he had argued out the previous night until he could say it in his sleep. He laid out the jurisdictional argument. When he had finished, Rowan Dace looked at her documents for a long moment. "The 10-day residence requirement is the question," she said. "If the claimants dispute the date of entry, I dispute nothing about the law," Factor Lenny said. "I dispute the date of entry." "The ford crossing," Ghorza said. Everyone looked at her. It was the first time she had spoken. "David Sutton crossed the Coldwater Ford on the morning 14 days ago," she said. "You can verify the date by his supply runner's log, which he keeps with his tools. The runner went to the monastery the day before we left and recorded the date in the log, as is David's practice. The Valley Charter defines entry as crossing any water feature that forms the valley's natural boundary. The Coldwater is that boundary. We crossed it 14 days ago." Rowan Dace was very still. "That would meet the 10-day requirement." "It would," Ghorza said, "by 4 days." There was a silence. Factor Lenny said, "The supply runner's log is at the estate worksite and can be retrieved if the mediator requires it," Ghorza said. "I am willing to wait." David looked at her. She was not looking at him. She was looking at Rowan Dace with the level amber gaze that gave nothing away and asked nothing back. He had not told her about the runner's log. He had mentioned it in passing once, when he was talking through his work documentation to himself at the cistern. She had been operating the winch 20 feet away. She had remembered it for 2 weeks and used it at exactly the right moment. Rowan Dace looked at Factor Lenny's. Factor Lenny's looked at Sarah Copperstone. Sarah looked at Ghorza. Something passed between them. David couldn't read it fully, but it had the weight of old history and contested terrain. Sarah Copperstone spoke for the first time. "We concede the date question," she said. Factor Lenny's turned to her sharply. "Copperstone, we concede it," Sarah said again. Her voice was flat. "The charter claim does not hold." She closed her ledger slate. "The company has other options." The implied threat in that last sentence was clear. Rowan Dace closed her file. "The Iron Hill claim is dismissed under Valley Charter jurisdiction," she said. "The transit writ stands in full. I'll note my ruling for the Valley Lord's record." She looked at Factor Lenny's. "If the company wishes to pursue this further, they may file with the Valley Court, which meets in 3 months. Factor Lenny said nothing. She gathered her documents and looked at David once, a long, measuring look, and then she turned and walked away through the square. The 2 riders followed. Sarah Copperstone stood a moment longer. She was looking at Ghorza. "The clan chief is gone," she said. In Orcish, but slowly enough for David to catch the edges of meaning, or perhaps she was saying it for him as much as for Ghorza. "He died in the autumn. The gambling debts died with him." Ghorza was very still. "When?" "A month after you were taken, fever." Sarah looked at the ground for a moment. "I knew when the order came through. I told myself it was business." She didn't say anything else. She turned and walked in a different direction from the Iron Heel women, and the crowd in the square watched her go, and then it went back to being a market. David stood at the table with his documents in his hand, and the noise of the market reforming around him, and looked at Ghorza. She had not moved. Her eyes were fixed on something in the middle distance, and he could see her processing something complicated, the news about the clan chief, the question of what it meant to be free of someone through death rather than through justice, the closed door of a thing she had expected to feel one way about, and that felt differently than she'd planned. He took a step toward her and stopped. He didn't know what she needed. He wanted to put his hand on her arm and say something, but he was aware that he might be wrong about what she needed right now, and being wrong felt like a worse option than waiting. She turned her head and looked at him. "I am free," she said, not triumphantly. Just as a fact she was turning over, checking the edges of. "You are," he said. "I could go back to the clan territory." "You could," he said, "or wherever you wanted." He kept his voice level. "You're free to go wherever you want." She looked at him for a long moment. The market moved around them, people in stalls and the ordinary noise of a valley town doing its business in the thin autumn sunlight. "Wherever I want," she said slowly. "Yes." She took 2 steps toward him, closing most of the distance between them, and looked down at him from her height with the amber eyes that had been reading him since the first moment on the platform, and she said, "Then tell me, David Sutton. "Where do you want me to go?" He opened his mouth, closed it, looked up at her. "Here," he said. "I want you to stay here." She didn't smile, but something in her face shifted in a way that was better than a smile, something that was the absence of the controlled distance she had been carrying since he'd met her, and she said, "Then here I will stay." The winter settled into Thornwater Valley like something finding a chair it intended to occupy for some time, and David Sutton and Ghorza Steeljaw settled along with it. The arrangement was, in practical terms, straightforward. David had contracts in the valley that would carry through to spring. The inn had a room. Mags raised an eyebrow and asked no more questions than she had before, which was Mags's version of approval. David's clients were mostly the homesteaders, who were a practical people, and tended to assess things by whether they worked rather than by what they looked like, and Ghorza worked, with the focused competence that was apparently simply how she did things. She did not become domestic. She was not the kind of person who became domestic. But she was intensely good at practical problem-solving, and the valley in winter threw problems at people with some regularity. And by the time the first deep snow came, she had helped Holt's wife reinforce a barn wall that was threatening to blow in, assisted David in completing a cistern before the ground froze solid, and apparently reached some kind of wordless mutual respect with the mill town's elderly blacksmith, who communicated mostly in grunts and seemed to require nothing more from her in return. David watched all of this with the particular attention of a man who is watching someone who matters to him find their footing, and tried not to be too obvious about it. He was not very successful at the not being obvious part. She noticed. He knew she noticed because she was Ghorza Steeljaw, and Ghorza Steeljaw noticed everything. What she did with it initially was say nothing, which was also, he was learning, her style. She did not rush things that she had not fully decided about, and she was more deliberate than anyone he had spent this much time with, making decisions in the particular way that suggested she had been wrong about something important once and intended never to be again. The Thornwater Winter Market was held in the third month after the harvest, and it was a bigger affair than the fortnightly market, 3 days, traders coming up from the lower valley and over from the eastern ridge town, a social event as much as a commercial one, with a great bonfire in the square and the particular festive energy of people who had been inside too long and wanted noise and company. It was at the winter market that everything became public in a way that small valley towns specialize in making things public. The market had a fighting ring. Not a killing ring, nothing like that. The Valley Charter was specific about conduct, but a wrestling and grappling competition that was tradition, open entry, prize money subscribed by the merchants, and a reputation that drew competitors from the whole Upper Valley. The prize was substantial, 12 silver marks, which was serious money in a winter market. David heard about it from Holt, who mentioned it the morning of the market's second day with the slightly careful casualness of a man who had something he wanted to say and wasn't sure how. "The Greenville companies come up," Holt said. "They were in the square, having come to pick up some hardware. The logging company from the eastern ridge. 3 of their women are competing in the ring this year." "Good field," David said, and began to see where this was going. "One of them is Petra Vane," Holt said. "You know that name?" He did. Petra Vane was a name the Valley's fighting tradition talked about in the specific reverent tone it reserved for people who had won the winter market ring 4 years running without a defeat. She was large, she was strong, and she was, by general consensus, very hard to put on the ground. "And someone's told Petra Vane about Ghorza," David said. Holt scratched his neck. "Someone may have. The Greenville girls have been talking at the tavern, saying things about the orc woman who came down the mountain with the well-digger." He paused, saying them in a particular way. David was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to say something to her," Holt offered, "about the ring, in case she wants to enter." "She'll make her own decision," David said. "Don't push her toward anything." But Ghorza had already heard. He found that out an hour later when he found her at the ring's registration table, writing her name with the careful, precise penmanship of someone who had taught themselves letters in a language not their own. He came to stand beside her. She finished writing and turned to look at him. "You knew they were talking," he said. "I have been listening to the tavern since yesterday evening," she said. "Petra Vane has told 3 people that the orc woman is only here because a human man bought her. She said it where she expected it to reach me. And you're going to prove her wrong." "I am going to enter the ring competition," Ghorza said, "because the prize is 12 silver marks and that would cover your rope debt to the monastery." She paused. "Also, yes, I am going to prove her wrong." He looked at her face, which had the particular still quality it got when she had made a decision and would not be changed. "All right," he said. "You are not going to tell me not to." "No," he said. "I'm not going to tell you not to." She looked at him for a moment in a way that meant something he was still learning to translate. Then she turned back to the registration table. The competition drew the entire market. By the time it was late afternoon and the bonfire had been lit, and the ring was full of firelight and torchlight, the square was shoulder to shoulder with people who had come for the commerce and stayed for this. There were 8 entrants, 2 from the local valley, 3 from the Greenville Logging Company, 2 from the Eastern Ridge town, and Ghorza, who stood at the ring's edge and looked at the competition with the expression of someone doing arithmetic. David stood at the edge of the crowd where she could see him if she looked. She looked. Once. Then she looked back at the ring. The first 2 bouts were over quickly. Ghorza dispatched her first opponent, one of the Ridge Town women, in under 2 minutes, smoothly and without apparent effort, and the crowd's noise shifted from the general roar of entertainment to something more specific and attentive. People who had been talking to each other stopped talking. The Greenville Logging women were watching from the opposite side of the ring. One of them was Petra Vane, who was everything her reputation promised, built like a river oak, confident in the way of someone who had won often enough to forget what losing felt like. She watched Ghorza's second bout, against one of the Valley women, which lasted 4 minutes and ended with the Valley woman graciously conceding, and David watched Petra Vane watch it, and he did not like the quality of her attention. He found out why in the semifinal, when Petra Vane was supposed to fight the other Greenville woman and didn't. She'd arranged with her colleague to concede early, which put Petra in the final without having fought a real bout, fresh and unbruised. Ghorza noticed. David saw her notice it, saw her look across the ring at Petra and then look at the crowd and do the calculation. The final drew a crowd that had pressed so close the market stalls on the south side were inaccessible. The bonfire threw orange light, and the torches burned in their brackets, and the noise in the square was enormous. Petra Vane stepped into the ring and looked at Ghorza with the confident smile of someone who believed they understood the terms of what they were doing. "Heard you came down the mountain on a man's coin," Petra said. The square was loud enough that only the people nearest heard it, but the people nearest included the other Greenville women and 3 of the Valley homesteaders and a merchant from the Ridge town who had sharp ears and would repeat what he heard. Ghorza said nothing. "No shame in it," Petra continued. "Lot of orc women can't make it on their own. That's just the way of things." David was at the ring's edge. The crowd was pressed tight around him. He was aware of several things simultaneously. The particular hostile energy of the Greenville group, the more complicated mixed energy of the Valley crowd, some of whom had formed opinions about Ghorza over the past 3 months that were different from whatever they'd come in expecting to think, and the still, gathered quality in Ghorza's stance that he had learned to recognize as the moment before she did something definitive. He was also aware, with a clarity that he had been walking up to for 3 months without allowing himself to look directly at, how much she mattered to him. How much the way she stood in that ring, collected and terrifyingly capable and slightly cold-faced from the winter air, made something in him pull hard toward her. "She's magnificent," he said. He didn't say it loudly. He said it the way you say a thing when it comes out before you've decided to say it, when the thought and the words meet at the exit without planning it. but the crowd was pressed close enough, and the square had that particular acoustic quality of cold air and stone buildings, and it carried. He became aware of Petra Vane's two colleagues turning to look at him. Ghorza turned her head. She looked at him, not at the ring, not at Petra, not at the crowd, at him. And he held her gaze and didn't look away. He felt his face go warm in the cold air, but he didn't flinch from it because it was true, and he had stopped pretending things that were true weren't true. Sometime around the 4th week they'd worked side by side in the high valley, and she had handed him back the winch controls, and their hands had overlapped for one moment, and neither of them had moved. She did not look away either. She held his gaze with those amber eyes for 3 full seconds in the middle of the ring, in front of 200 people in the bonfire light, and her face changed, not to the almost laugh, not to the controlled calm, but to something open and direct and very certain. Then she turned back to Petra Vane. The bout lasted 90 seconds. Petra Vane was good. She was very good, in fact, stronger than she looked and faster than her size suggested, and she committed hard to her first offensive move, which was a high grip aimed at Ghorza's shoulder that would have given her a controlling position if it had landed. It didn't land. Ghorza was not where she had been. She had stepped inside the grip with a turn that was smooth enough to look choreographed, and she used Petra's own committed momentum against her, redirecting it downward and outward, and Petra Vane went into the ring dirt with an impact that the crowd felt physically. The square went very quiet for about 1 second. Then it erupted. Even the people who had been watching with ambivalence were making noise, because whatever their opinions about orc women or well-diggers or winter market drama, they had come to see a fight, and they had just seen something remarkable, and the human body's response to remarkable things overrides considered opinion every time. Petra Vane sat up in the ring dirt and looked at Ghorza with an expression that had lost its confidence and gained something else in its place, something that was working its way toward respect even if it hadn't quite arrived. Ghorza stood above her and offered her hand. Petra Vane took it. The noise the square made then was different from the combat roar, warmer, more complicated. Ghorza walked out of the ring and came directly to where David was standing, and she stopped in front of him and she looked at him, and she was still looking at him the way she had been looking at him when he'd said it. "Magnificent," she said. "Yes," he said. "You said it in front of half the valley." "I know." She looked at him for another breath. Her eyes were doing the reading something written thing, and he let her read because whatever was written there was for her and he was not going to obscure it. "You meant it," she said, not a question. "I meant it," he said. "I've been meaning it for a while." She reached out then with her right hand, and she put it against the side of his face, and she held it there, warm and certain and very deliberate, and the crowd around them was busy doing other things, but the world had gone very quiet anyway, the way worlds do when something important is happening in the small circle of 2 people. "David Sutton," she said. "Ghorza," he said. "I would like to stop pretending that I did not also mean something," she said. "Then stop pretending," he said. She brought her face down to his, and she kissed him, there in the firelight, with the winter market noise around them and the bonfire warm and the valley watching or not watching according to its own preference. And it was a kiss that had 3 months of careful distance and 2 weeks of cold mountain trails and 90 seconds of something that had looked like effortless magnificence, but was actually the product of every hard year she'd ever lived behind it. And he put his hands on her face and kissed her back. The prize was 12 silver marks. Rowan Dace pressed them into Ghorza's hand at the end of the evening, with a look that was warm and slightly amused and entirely professional, and Ghorza held them for a moment and then turned to David. "This is your rope money," she said. "It's your prize," he said. "It is our money," she said, with the particular quality of someone who was not making a poetic statement but a factual one, and he was too warm and too certain of things to argue, and he didn't. Mags raised both eyebrows when they came back to the inn that evening, and did not say a word, which was the loudest approval David had ever received from her. The winter settled deeper and the valley contracted to its winter rhythms, and things between them changed in the way things change when the distance has been crossed, and there is no longer any pretending about it. She was warm in a way she had not allowed herself to be before, direct and unapologetic about it, which was consistent with everything else about her. When Ghorza Steeljaw decided something, she decided it fully. She decided him. She was clear about it in the small, daily ways that turned out to matter more than declarations. The way she made room for him without being asked. The way she deferred to his knowledge of the valley routes without losing any of her own authority in the deference. The way she reached for him in the cold evenings at the inn, with the uncomplicated certainty of someone who knew what she wanted, and was no longer in any mood to pretend otherwise. There was an evening, deep in the heart of winter when the snow had been falling for 3 days, and the valley was muffled under white, when they were in the small room at the inn with a fire going and the outside world entirely inaccessible, and she sat behind him and rebraided his hair, which had gotten long enough to need it, with the same focused precision she applied to everything. He sat still under her hands and felt something he did not have a good word for, which was the particular piece of being cared for by someone who was choosing to do it, not out of obligation but out of desire, and he understood for the first time in what felt like a very long time what it meant to not be lonely. "My clan name," she said. "Steel. Oh, you know what it means." "Strong jaw," he guessed. "Something like that." "It means a jaw that does not release," she said. "It is given to warriors who hold their position, who do not let go of what they have committed to." Her hands paused in his hair for a moment. "I committed to you. I want you to know I understand what that means." He turned around to look at her. Her face was very close and very certain. "I committed to you too," he said, "back on the goat track in the dark. You were helping me escape." "I was helping you escape and I was also committing to you," he said. "Both things can be true." Her mouth curved. She pulled him back around by the shoulder and continued braiding, and he let her, and the fire was warm and the snow was deep and nothing was unresolved. When the pass began to show the first signs of opening in early spring, the question of the monastery debt came back into focus. David had 11 silver marks from the winter's work, the 12 from Ghorza's prize having covered the rope money and the worst of the outstanding debts with mags, and he needed to go back up the mountain to complete the 2 outstanding cisterns before the estate owner arrived in the valley. He assumed Ghorza would come with him. He was right. They were on the road 2 days after the first thaw, with new rope on his pack and Ghorza carrying the survey tools, and the mood between them easy and warm, the way it had been all winter, the way he suspected it was going to be for a very long time. The monastery market was different in spring. Lighter, louder, the energy of people who had been cooped up on both sides of the mountain finally getting to trade and talk and argue with each other again. The monks had put up new banners, the cobblestones had been swept clean of winter's accumulation, and Brother Aldrich was at his desk looking like a man who had spent 3 months reading and was genuinely pleased to have a problem. He looked at David when they walked in. He looked at Ghorza. He looked at David again. "The 2 cisterns," David said. "We're here to finish them." "Yes," Brother Aldrich said. "I have your notes, very thorough notes." He paused. "Vaskin's contract claim was formally closed by the Valley Court in the 2nd month," he said, "on grounds of irregular origination. Someone filed documentary evidence that the original sale was conducted under duress and without proper clan authority." He looked at his desk. "The filing was anonymous." Ghorza was very still beside David. "Who would do that?" she said. Brother Aldrich's expression did not change. "The filing was anonymous," he repeated. "The monastery's legal archive notes only that the evidence was compelling." Sarah Copperstone, David thought. He thought about saying it out loud and decided it didn't require saying. Ghorza was quiet for a moment. "The case is fully closed," she said. "Fully," Brother Aldrich confirmed. "No residual claims. The Valley Court's ruling supersedes any prior commercial agreement." He looked at David. "The 2 cisterns are needed before the estate owner arrives. He's coming up in 6 weeks. "We'll have them done," David said. I brought the right rope this time. Brother Aldrich looked almost amused. See that you do. They worked the high valley for 3 weeks. The cisterns were harder than the winter had left them. The frost had done things to 2 of the footings that needed correcting first. But they worked well, and the days were long now, the mountain light lasting well past supper. And the high valley in spring was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have been holding the beauty back all winter and can finally release it. There was an evening toward the end of the 3rd week, with both cisterns finished and only the testing and sealing left, when they were sitting on the flat rock above the cottage where the view of the whole valley opened to the south, the mill town a collection of small dark rooftops and the river catching the last of the light. "I want to stay in the valley," Ghorza said. He looked at her. She was looking at the view. "There is nothing for me in the clan territory now," she said. "The chief is dead. The cohort scattered after the midsummer. The people I called my people are wherever they landed." She paused. "I could find them, rebuild something there. I thought about it all winter." "And?" he said. "And my people are where I decide they are," she said. She turned to look at him. "I am Steeljaw. I do not release what I have committed to." He held her gaze. "What are you committing to?" "You," she said. "This valley, the work." She turned back to the view. "I want to negotiate with the estate owner when he arrives, for a formal position. Your work brings in enough for 2 if it is organized correctly, and the valley needs what we do together more than it needs what either of us does alone." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a practical argument." "I am practical," she said. "I am also—" She paused. It was one of the rare pauses where she was actually finding a word rather than choosing between several. "I am not good at saying the other part." "Try," he said gently. She turned her head and looked at him with her amber eyes in the last of the evening light, and she said, "I was alone for a very long time before I understood that I was. I thought that was what strength was. You taught me that it is not." Her voice was steady, but it had the quality of something said from a place she didn't go to often. "I want to stay because this is where I am not alone. You are where I am not alone." He put his hand over hers on the rock. She turned her hand and held his. "Then we stay," he said. "And we negotiate with the estate owner together." The estate owner was a man named Cord Velam, who arrived in late spring in a good coach with a personal secretary and the particular air of a wealthy man who was accustomed to finding his instructions followed. He was not unpleasant exactly, but he had the habit of looking through people he considered functionary. And when David and Ghorza came to the estate house to complete the formal handover of the cistern work, he looked at Ghorza in the specific way that wealthy men sometimes look at things that don't fit their expectations of the landscape. David had anticipated this. "Cistern system I've built here," he said, before Velam could organize his expression into something that would be difficult to walk back from, "is the best waterwork in the upper valley. You'll get 40 years out of it without major maintenance if you do the annual inspections correctly. The person who is going to tell you what those inspections require and who is going to do them is Ghorza Steeljaw-a, who co-designed the system and knows every joint in it personally." Velam looked at him, then at Ghorza, then back at David. "You're proposing a caretaker arrangement," he said. "I'm proposing a maintenance contract," David said. "Reasonable terms, annual rate, covering all the water infrastructure on the estate and access to our expertise for any expansion you want in future. You've got 3 fields that could benefit from irrigation cisterns along the east slope. The survey work alone would cost you double from anyone else, and they wouldn't know the ground the way we do." Velam was quiet for a moment. His secretary was writing things down. "What are your terms?" Velam said, in the slightly different tone of a man who has moved from dismissal into negotiation. David had prepared the terms in writing, which surprised Velam, and he and Ghorza had worked them out together the previous evening at the cottage, which surprised him even more when he understood the precision of the language and asked who had written it. David had, from their joint discussion, and the precision was mostly Ghorza's, because she thought in the kind of careful sequential logic that made legal documents readable. The negotiation was blunt and took 2 hours, and ended with a contract that was better than David had privately hoped for when he'd begun it. Velem was not a generous man, but he was a practical one, and the cisterns were exceptional work, and Ghorza had walked him through the structural logic of the East Slope irrigation possibility with a clarity that had clearly made an impression. When Velem's coach departed back down the road to his primary estate in the lower valley, David and Ghorza stood in front of the cottage with the signed contract between them and the spring mountain around them and the cold water audible in the distance. "That is 12 months of secure income," she said. "Yes, and the East Slope survey is 4 months of work on its own, at least." She turned to look at him. She was not containing anything now, and her face was the open, direct, certain face that she had shown him on and off since the winter market and that he intended to spend a great deal of his future looking at. "We have a future," she said, not a question, a recognition of something that had arrived. "We do," he said. She stepped toward him and took him by the front of his coat and looked at him from her height with those amber eyes and said, "Then I claim it." "You claim it," he agreed. "Or custom," she said. "When a warrior claims something, she marks it as hers." He had a thought about that. "Are you talking about—" "Yes," she said, "if you consent." He looked up at her for a moment, the woman who had been watching him carefully since the first moment on the platform and had chosen him again and again since then with the full weight of everything she was, and he said, "Yes, I consent." She tilted his head with her hand very gently and pressed a kiss to the side of his neck that was warm and deliberate, and when she lifted her head there was a mark there, not deep but present, the particular warmth of it spreading outward. "Mine," she said. "Yours," he said, and pulled her face down to his. They kissed in the spring sunlight in front of the cottage with the cold water sounding in the distance and the high valley green around them, and it was unhurried and thorough and very certain, and when it ended, he kept his hands in her hair, and she kept her forehead against his, and they held still for a moment, the way you hold still when you are in a place you intend to remember. Later, with the stove warm in the cottage and the evening coming blue and soft over the valley, they sat close together and made plans in the practical, detailed way of two people who have decided that their future is going to be built rather than waited for. The spring survey would start in 2 weeks. The East Slope work would run through summer. The contract with Velem guaranteed income through the year, and if the East Slope irrigation proved successful, he had mentioned the possibility of recommendations to 2 neighboring estates, which David knew from experience would mean at minimum a conversation that could turn into another contract. The monastery's remaining debt was manageable now, and getting more manageable weekly. Mags had mentioned, when they'd come down the mountain in the spring, that she had a room available on an extended basis with a hearth and a second window, which was as close as Mags came to suggesting they might want something more permanent than what they had. "The room at Mags's," Ghorza said. "I was thinking about it," he said. "It is a good room." "It is. Are you asking if I think we should take it?" She leaned against him slightly, which was something she had been doing more often lately and which he liked in a way that was deeper than comfort. "I am asking if you want to," she said. "There is a difference." "I want to," he said. "I want to spend the off-season in the valley instead of on the mountain, and I want to do it with you in a room with a hearth and a second window." She made a soft sound. "Then we will." He turned his head and kissed her temple, the one with the old scar, and felt her exhale against him. "The rope money," he said, thinking of the trail that had led them here, "cost me more than I expected." "Did it?" she said dryly. "It cost me the rope money and then 3 months of complicated logistics and then 12 silver marks and a winter of not saying what I meant and then a contract negotiation, and eventually it cost me the side of my neck." "That is a significant cost," she agreed, without any remorse. "Worth every copper," he said. She pulled back enough to look at him, and she looked at him with the full, open, amber-eyed attention that she had been focusing on him since the beginning, and she said, very quietly, "Yes, it was." The summer came in strong and warm, and they surveyed the east slope and planned the cisterns and worked the ground together, and the valley watched them the way small valley towns watch things they have decided to accept, which is with a mix of curiosity and pragmatic warmth. Because the valley's homesteaders were practical people, and practical people tend, eventually, toward whatever works. What worked was Ghorza Steeljaw-a and David Sutton. The summer market at Thornwater was smaller than the winter one, more a practical affair than a festive one, but it had the quality of reunion that all markets have in valleys where people winter in relative isolation, and a lot of the conversation was the kind that catches up on what had happened and what had changed. Holt's wife cornered David at the hardware stall with the air of someone who had been waiting for an appropriate moment and had decided this was adequate. "You're staying in the valley," she said. "Not a question. We are," he said. She nodded with the satisfied quality of someone whose prediction had come true. "Good. I need those east slope cisterns, and Ghorza told me what to do about the barn drainage, and I need her where I can ask her follow-up questions." He laughed, which surprised him. "I'll let her know she's needed." "She knows," Holt's wife said comfortably. "She's been telling Holt about the drainage slope for a week. I just wanted you to know the same." Ghorza found him at the tool stall an hour later with 12 feet of rope over her shoulder, which she had apparently judged to be the most immediately necessary purchase, and the rope money for once was not in question. "Holt's wife says she needs you," he said. "She needs the drainage answer," Ghorza corrected, but she looked pleased. "She needs both of you," he said. "The valley does." She looked at him, the steady amber look. "We," he said, "are needed." She put the rope down and put her hand on his face again, the way she had in the ring square with the bonfire and the crowd, and she kissed him in the middle of the summer market among the stalls, with Holt watching and Mags watching from across the square, and Rowan Dace possibly watching from her dry goods table. And the sun was warm on his back, and she was warm in front of him, and the valley was exactly where they belonged. The contract with Velem came through in full by autumn. The East Slope cisterns were completed, and Velem's secretary arrived with the payment and a second letter of recommendation, already written, addressed to the two neighboring estate owners that David had suspected were possibilities. The letter mentioned, specifically, both names, David Sutton and Ghorza Steeljaw-a, joint contractors, and it described the cistern work in language that made it clear Velem understood he had gotten something exceptional. David read the letter twice. Ghorza read it once and handed it back. "He spelled my name correctly," she said. "He did. His secretary is thorough. Very." He folded the letter carefully and put it in his document case. "2 new contracts." Potentially, she agreed. "We should answer before the autumn rains close the road." He looked at her. She was already thinking about the logistics, the survey timing and the ground conditions and the particular challenge of the Eastern Estates access road, and she had a small crease in her brow that meant she was working through something, and he watched her work and felt the warmth of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be and knows it without needing to say so. He said it anyway. "Ghorza." She looked up. "I love you," he said. She went still. Not with surprise, exactly. She had the quality of someone for whom this was not news, but for whom hearing it said plainly and without any other context required a moment of receiving. Then she set her papers down and crossed to him in 2 steps and took his face in both hands and said, "I love you, David Sutton. I have loved you since the goat track in the dark, and I have been saying it in every other language except the plain one for months." "I know," he said. "Say it again," she said. "I love you." She kissed him, hard and warm and entirely without reserve. And when she pulled back, her eyes were bright and certain, and she was looking at him the way she always looked at him when she had decided something, with that full, committed, Steeljaw attention that he had long since understood was the most complete version of being seen he had ever experienced. "Now," she said, pulling back and picking up her papers with the practical directness that was also entirely her, "let us write to the estate owners before the rains come." He sat down beside her and they wrote the letters, side by side, her draft and his corrections and her improved corrections and his final draft, and outside the window of the room at Mags's in the autumn valley went gold and brown, and the cold water ran somewhere in the distance, and the past that had been the beginning of everything was still and quiet above them. They sent the letters. Both estate owners wrote back. The work continued, and the valley was theirs, and they were each other's, and the rope money had been worth it after all.